Hi, everybody. So today I want to talk to you about the need for experiences that differentiate your company. And one of the best ways to create them is through persona-driven storytelling. So given the growth in content marketing, the growth in channels, the growth in different ways to reach and engage buyers, the majority of marketers, I think it's 89%, believe that improving the customer experience across the entirety of the relationship is what will differentiate their companies. And so I think it's really important that we think about what that means and how storytelling can be a major component of how you do that. So why is it so hard? I'd like to propose that the reason it's so hard to improve the customer experience is because perception is skewed. Okay, so we as marketers spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to get our buyers to do what we want them to, right? So we think about that, how are we going to drive that outcome that we want, rather than what do they really need and want from us? How do we actually meet and exceed their expectations? But the other thing, and here's where personas come into play, perception is skewed about who our buyers are and how they see themselves. And I think this picture is a great representation of the difference, right? So we look at our buyer and we're gonna see the yellow cat, but when they look at themselves, they see the king of the jungle. So we need to narrow that gap. And one of the best ways to do that I know is with personas. And so let's talk about the other reason why the way we run marketing programs today is impeding our ability to improve the experience. I would submit that it's because most of us still run campaigns. The biggest problem with campaign in a B2B complex purchasing process is that it ends. So if you look at those dominoes on the screen, and let's say your buyer starts at the bottom and they get through a number of touch points and they're making progress, and then your campaign ends. Because that's the structure of a campaign, has a start and a stop date. So now look at the dominoes on the other side of the hand, which is the end point. We are leaving our buyers hanging, right? We're not telling the rest of the story. And so what do they do to get that information? So here's the thing I really want you to get. It's difficult enough to engage our buyers, so why in the world would we ever want to halt momentum once we've built it up? And that's exactly what we're doing when we stop a campaign. So take a look at this difference. In my latest book, Digital Relevance, I spend a lot of time talking about a continuum, that we need to engage from end to end across the process, that we need to tell a continuous story that helps them get from point A, status quo, to the end, which is choice to buy. When you look at the campaigns on the top of the screen, most of the time campaigns are theme-driven, right? So we're gonna send out a campaign around productivity, let's say, and then it's gonna end and we're gonna tally up our results, and which is really why we have campaigns as a construct, so we have something to measure, right, and report on. And while we're doing that and tallying up the results, not only have we halted momentum and caused our buyers to go search for information they need elsewhere to continue the story, but we've got dead air until we launch the next campaign. But here's the problem. You launch the next campaign and it's on a different subject. Let's say we decided, or probably some executive at your company said, this quarter I want us to talk about efficiency. So now we've started up again, but we're talking about something totally different. And the prospect that you were engaging around productivity is going, okay, what happened? Where's the rest of my story? You know? So now look at the stream across the bottom. And it starts with status quo, which is when they're sitting there and they're not thinking about change. So when they first encounter your content, their response is pretty much, why should I care, right? And if you answer that question and convince them it's worth thinking about, the next thing they're going to do is say, okay, fine. But what happens if we do nothing? How bad could it be? Right? Now, Tim Reister talked this morning about status quo and motivating change and that kind of thing. But what we really need to think about is this series of interactions where it's kind of this push and pull, where they're going to ask a question, get some information, hopefully that opens up a new question, and they're seeking information, and it's that back and forth that needs to continue to build. The problem a lot of us have is we already know our product. We think it's a slam dunk, that people should know they need it, that they need to solve the problem, that they need what we're selling. So we start too far into the story, and we miss out on helping build that vision for change that Tim was talking about. So we need to get in earlier. So now that we've talked about campaigns, let's talk about story. So story, especially one that's persona-driven, motivates your buyers or your audience to take action. Not once, but repeatedly. Just like you engage a reader to turn the pages of a book and continue through the chapters, the story you tell has to be built around the concept of what's next, driving them to continue to make progress. So this means that it needs to address their aspirations, it needs to be meaningful, it needs to resonate. And here's the most important reason why. Now, a lot of people talk about storytelling, but we actually have science that proves that a story is the only way to activate parts in the brain so that a listener turns the story into their own idea and experience. Okay, and this was discovered in research by Yuri Hassan, who's a neuroscientist at Princeton. So here's why this is so critical. In a B2B buying process, there's generally a committee, especially if it's a complex sale. These people need to talk to each other. They're going to have meetings behind closed doors that we are not in. But if we can create a compelling enough story, they're going to take our ideas and internalize them and take them into those meetings and discussions for us, because we're going to help set that vision. We're going to become the anchor for how they think about solving the problem. And the anchor concept is based on research that Dan Ariely did. He wrote the book Predictably Impossible. What he found was that until you decide you want to buy something or make a change, you don't have any attachment to anything. There's no anchor for it. But let's say, and the research he did was based on widescreen TVs. Or flat screen. As soon as you decided you wanted a flat screen TV, the first one that really caught your eye becomes the anchor, right? And so then you use that anchor to evaluate every other TV you look at. And so the anchor really is the reference point. And so the other TV has to compete against that anchor and beat it out. Now, if we as marketers can tell the story that becomes the anchor, that allows them to turn our ideas into their experience, then everybody else has to beat us out. That's why I think stories are so compelling. Now, let's talk about buyer personas and how they influence story. So there's a lot of talk about buyer personas out there. A lot of it makes me not happy. But when you look at the criticizers of buyer personas, they're usually referencing personas that are very lightweight, that maybe have demographics, other things that are surface level and not really useful. In a B2B situation, a buyer persona needs a lot of depth. And so listed on this screen are components that I include when I develop buyer personas, including a day in the life, objectives or goals, but also the flip side. What's the problem that keeps them from getting there? Their professional attributes, which is as close to demographics as a buyer persona should get. the questions they have across the buying process, the obstacles they encounter, which could be way beyond budget, to people pushing back, naysayers, the idea of too much risk, disruption, whatever. We need to know what those are. But one of the biggest missed opportunities when creating personas is that we don't dive deep enough to understand the relationships they have with the other stakeholders, right? So what do those look like? We tend to go out and create a nurture program for Dan, a nurture program for Mary, and whoever else, and we do them in silos. We never think about the fact that they have to talk to each other. Their paths cross, and we need to understand what those relationships look like. So if one of them is the champion for the project and the other one is pushing back, how do we help the champion answer the pushback, right? We need to understand those dynamics. So let's talk about a few of these things. A day in the life of your persona can help you with that. So think of it as a narrative written in first person as if this persona is talking to you, right? We want to understand their context of what their situation looks like today. Who else on the buying committee are they interacting with? You know, and this is something like, you know, Dawn's always coming up to me in the hall and asking for X, but that's really difficult to do because my boss says no and blah, 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 whatever. So it's kind of a, you know, a narrative about the dynamics of the situation. So it helps us understand the relationships with stakeholders. The only way you're really going to get this information is if you actually go out and talk to your customers. This isn't something you can make up. Or talk to lost prospects, right, who decided not to buy and figure out why. Because something got in the way of that. And if we understand these relationships better, we can create content that helps whoever our audience for that content is, that persona, be able to have better conversations in those situations. So we need to understand also what's getting in the way of them moving forward. Most of the time it is not price, although I just had a client where it is price because the margins are so small. But most of the time it's not price. So something else is getting in the way. And we need to understand what's important to them professionally. So there's been a lot of talk about emotions and addressing emotions in your content because, of course, we're all people, right? Which we don't do. But in a B2B situation, the emotional involvement is usually about their career or looking good in front of their peers or leaving a legacy because they're getting close to retiring or something. But we need to know what's important to them professionally, at least as a common factor that relates to a majority of them. So professional attributes. This is as close as you need to get to demographics. I don't care if they're 35 or 52. What I do care about is how long have they been in this career, right? Is this a new career path for them? Maybe it's a second career. Are they fresh out of college and they're just starting? Have they been at the same company long enough to know where all the bodies are buried so they can take risk and get stuff through? So we need to understand some of these things. Some of this you can find out in your interviews, but also I get a lot of this kind of information from LinkedIn profiles. I pretty much live on LinkedIn, and I'd like to shoot whoever took away advanced search. But you know, there's tons of information in profiles, and sometimes you have to go through a bunch of them to get to the information. But where else could you find pretty much a collection of profiles written by the people who are your buyers, or could be? I mean, it's fascinating to me. Now, some of this stuff, like frustrations or influencers, those kinds of things, you find in the recommendations. So for example, I'll go through 100 profiles when I'm building a persona. And if I start seeing repeatedly, you know, so-and-so was a great mentor to me. They really took their time in teaching me what I needed to know to excel in my career. If I start seeing that a bunch of time, then I'm gonna think, okay, mentor is a factor. So what I'm gonna focus on in a lot of my content is how whatever I'm telling them can be used to help their team excel, because they like to mentor people. So if they're an engineer and they're very detail-oriented, then I know I want to use a lot of facts and statistics, right? Not a lot of fluff. And these are kind of generalizations, but you get the point. So that's the kind of information that I'm looking for. And you can weave a lot of this into your content. It helps you decide what tone of voice you're going to use, what style of content you're going to create. Everybody makes blanket statements like short, snackable content is the new thing, but that may not be true for your buyers. It depends on the situation and what you're trying to accomplish. Now, this is my favorite part. Questions. Excuse me. Questions are huge. Questions are what drive conversations. So think about a typical conversation. It's really a series of Q&A back and forth, you know. Hi, Lee, how you doing? Lee says, Ardath, I'm doing great. Have you seen the new report on X? Well, yeah, I did, and on page 12 it says this. What do you think about this? Question and answer. Same thing when you're building a storyline out with your content, right? So here's the cool thing about questions. You can brainstorm a bunch of questions. They come out of the interviews, the research, put them on a whiteboard, on a list, on Post-it notes, whatever. They're going to almost self-organize. So for example, why should I care is not asked at the end of the story. It's pretty much the beginning thing that gets them engaged. But after they ask why should I care, they're not going to say, what are my options for solving the problem? They're going to say, well, how are my competitors dealing with it? And as they learn more, another question comes up. So when you have a question, you get it answered, you take in that information, that question goes away, but a new question comes up. So the whole point of this is trying to figure out what are those questions, how do we organize them in a way to create a story flow. Now, here's the kicker for this. Stories have to be developed in a linear fashion because otherwise it's hard to tell the story. But we have to create ways for people to access our content differently, right? Because you've seen those squiggly buyer journey things. It's no longer linear. So we may have to create it from beginning to end, but we have to figure out how to display it, share it, and engage them with it if they're in different parts of the process, right? If they already know they should care, then they need to be able to access information related to that. Obstacles are also step backs, like will users adopt it? What happens if they don't? What happens if it causes more disruption than we thought? What happens if the risk is higher than we thought? We also need content that addresses those things. So now let's talk about how do we combine buyer personas and story to create those engaging experiences. Well, you're going to start off with the components of a story. So you have your hero, which is your persona, and he is the hero of the story. It's not your product, it's not your company, it is your persona, okay? And then you have the mentor. In most stories, and we'll go through the story flow, the hero doesn't have what he needs to get to the end, so he needs a mentor to help him amass the tools and knowledge, and that is the role we play in the story. We are the mentor, okay? Then there's the villain, which is the problem in a business story, or the naysayers that are pushing back, or obstacles that are getting in his way. And then we have subplots, and these are the relationships with the other people on the buying committee. So these are the components we're going to use for our story. Now, when you develop a sustainable storyline, it's pretty much can be modeled on the same structure that would be used for a fictional story. You just think about it a little different. So you have your hero, the buyer. He has a problem or an aspiration, and something happens that makes him seek action, which means he needs to seek knowledge. And what he finds out when he sets out on this path is that he lacks the expertise to make the decision to buy, to make the best choice. So he asks questions, right? We've talked about questions. And then he encounters obstacles as he keeps trying to move forward. He finds the expertise he needs from you, his mentor, who also helps him gain consensus in the buying committee, which is the climax in a business story. Either they're going to gain consensus and choose to move forward, or they're not, which means no decision, right? Or buying from somebody else. And then hopefully they're going to choose to buy from you and achieve resolution to their problem. This is a classic story structure. And it can be suited perfectly to content designed to engage from beginning to end across the buying process. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So you start always with what does the buyer need to know to rattle the status quo, to make them say, oh my God, hey, we have a problem that we should solve. What does it take to do that? And then once you've done that, you got to make sure you answer that. Okay, here's what you need to know. Here's why it's worth solving the problem. Okay, how are you going to get him to really commit to taking action against where he's standing today? And then, when they discover they lack expertise to continue to move the project forward, whether that means people are pushing back, or they're not sure how to think about it, or somebody in IT says, I'd rather build it than buy it, or whatever, we need to figure out what's all that knowledge, expertise that they need to have to move forward. How can we provide it in a way that differentiates us from everybody else? And then how can we help them build consensus? Because if they can't get to consensus, we're wasting our time. CEB was just on the stage, and in the Challenger customer, they talked about the height of conflict in the buying committee, which happens about 37% of the way through the process. But yet, you all know the number, that 57%, or it keeps getting higher, which is when they reach out to a sales rep. So if the height of conflict is at 37% of the way through, and they decide to do nothing, how many opportunities are we missing because they never make it to that 57% point? This is why we need to tell the story from beginning to end and get in earlier. So now I want to talk about orchestrating the overlays, which is what I call facilitating that subplot, that buyer committee, sharing information across the buying committee. And it helps if you think about it in kind of a question and answer format, right? Once again. So in this case, this is kind of a Q&A between a product manager who's seeking to buy a collaboration platform to help his teams across the globe bring products to market faster. And so in the blue squares are his questions. So in the first one, how can our product design teams shorten time to market? Right? He's just in a state of inquiry at this point. And what he comes across is content from us. It says, hey, here's how a global collaboration platform helps designers iterate faster. And he ingests that information, and he's kind of like, okay, that's got possibilities. I like that. But, you know, my IT guy is a real stickler for security. And so, given the growth in data breaches, how secure is your cloud SaaS platform, right? To where he finds information about, here's what you need to know about security in the cloud. And he now says, okay, that's great, but I got one more problem. My HR person is pushing back on how easy it is to drive adoption. And by the same token, she's always complaining she doesn't have any money for training. So how do I deal with that? And what he finds is that you're hosting a webinar about how to fast-track user adoption with the gamification features, and you say, hey, why don't you come and bring your HR person with you? So we have to start thinking about how this works across teams. But the other thing we need to think about is engagement scenarios for execution, right? So we tend to put content together and put it out in channels without thinking about how are we building the story all the way through. So we need to think about what does it look like. So a lot of times I work with marketers, and one of the things that I ask them when we're working on a nurture program or what have you is, how many of you are subscribed to it? How many of you receive the emails and go through the process? Not very many. And let me tell you something, a campaign looks a lot different in a Word doc in your office than it does when you're on the receiving end after it's been published and it's out there. We need to actually go through these experiences, but we need to map them out and think about it. How are we getting from point A to point B? So in scenario one, let's say your buyer is on LinkedIn. He sees a status update with a link to a blog post that one of your SMEs wrote. He clicks through, and now he's on your Content Hub. Well, because you've done a great job of thinking this through, you have a C also that says, hey, if you like the blog post, here's a white paper with a deep dive on the subject. He says, this is cool, fills out the form, gets the white paper, and at the end, you've included an option for how he can share it with his team. So he does that. Well, now he's in your database, so a week or two later, scenario two, gets a nurture email with a link to an article, which he goes out and reads, and thinks these guys are pretty smart. So he tweets and shares with his network, and while he's out there with the article, he sees there's a webinar where you've invited analysts to talk about the topic. So he signs up. So we need to start thinking about how does all this work together instead of one-off content designed to do one thing. How does it fit as part of the story? So here's the really cool thing. Binging. How many of you binge on content? On Netflix or TV shows, watching seasons at a time? Yeah, a lot of you. Well, your buyers are just like us, right? They're watching TV, they're binging on the latest season of their favorite show, watching it all in one day, right? We need to help our buyers do the same thing. Research has found that quite often you get kind of what I call drive-by views, where they may engage and read something and go away and they don't really do anything else. Then all of a sudden you see this uptake in activity from a lead or within an account. And we need to enable them to go broad when they're in that mode. So this idea of putting out one drip at a time for a nurture program is great and fine and dandy, but when they're ready, we need to enable them to have access. So 93% of buyers want us to package information. Most websites, however, impede binging. They are designed, corporate website designs, for some reason we put everything in silos. We have white papers, videos, webinars, case studies, they're all in different places. So they don't tell a story. And we're actually expecting our buyers to expend the effort to go build the story themselves. And they're not going to do that. What we need to think about is content hubs. We need to think about organizing our information either by industry, by role, by problem to solution journey. And we can put the whole collection of information from beginning to end in one of these content hubs, which allows them to binge on content and learn what they need to know or share it with other members of the buying committee. Content hubs built for binging need to challenge the status quo, validate the problem, and help set the vision for the future state with the problem solved. Include content that answers all their questions as well as content that can be shared. So when you're doing this, here's the other kicker I want you to think about. You need to think evergreen, not reinventing the wheel every year. I have programs that have been working for 3 to 5 years. We go out once a year and update the information, change out the research to add in the new statistics, whatever's changed, maybe pull a piece out that's not performing, insert a new one. A new question comes up, so we write content for that and insert it. Maybe freshen the calls to action. But we need to think about how do we continue to build the story. And part of this goes to content maturity as well. It's said that content doesn't really reach its full maturity and SEO value for a few years. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, work to keep improving it. And we now have the technology that lets us do that. And that's what I have for you today. I hope there's something helpful to you. Thank you so very much.